All right, so question and answer session. One thing, Andre, that I thought might be a good place to start here, you talked a little bit there at the end just around exclusion zones and removing people from the hazard, basically, which is fantastic. That's, in terms of the hierarchy, the best you can possibly do. When I go around to construction sites, I see a lot of exclusion zones promoted, and there's different definitions of exclusion zones across different companies. Some exclusion zones allow certain people to be in them, some don't. What's your rule in relation to exclusion zones? When Acciona says exclusion zone, what do you guys mean?
What we've come up with, effectively consistent with WorkSafe Victoria guidelines, which our exclusion zones mandated at 15 metres by 5 metres by 5 metres. The tipping areas are an absolute no-go zone. We've mandated bollards at barriers to that effect with no one on the ground. So 12 to 15 metres no-go zone is at least the full zone of the truck trailers within the body range in terms of a radius.
Thank you. That's good. That clarifies things a bit more. And just in relation to, I guess, some of the substitution level controls you talked about particularly plant selection there and the use of other types of tip trucks, so side tippers and walking floors, for example. How's the organisation gone in terms of sourcing those sorts of things, given that rear tippers are so endemic, particularly on the east coast of Australia? It's pretty hard when you're driving around to see some of these other sorts of vehicles.
It's a really interesting question. We haven't gone so well. There's a whole host of reasons for that. The market on the east coast, well, in fact, indeed everywhere, is incredibly busy. So there is a shortage in particularly Sydney and Melbourne of tip trucks, which does exacerbate things somewhat. We've certainly started that process and put in place the selection of trucks and selection of suppliers based with specification that match the volumes and site conditions, David. We've considered factors such as engine power, suspension and off-road capabilities, depending obviously on the bespoke site conditions. And we're choosing trucks that can handle the required loads and operate effectively in any given environment, or that specific environment, if you like. We have put in place, and I do see it, I travel around the country often, and I was on a site in Bunbury about a month ago and a site at Coomera near the Gold Coast about a week ago, and stopped and actually really witnessed the unloading operation or delivery of materials to site via these trucks. I could see with my own eyes that there has been an advancement and that exclusion zone was in place. Like on one of the sites at Coomera, there was some overhead services which were prevalent. Every site's got different bespoke conditions. I do remain very optimistic that selection of trucks will, having different truck side tippers and things like that are bespoke and suitable for the right condition. I do see that being something that will become more and more mature. Right today, the selection isn't quite where we need it to be, but at least we're having those conversations, David.
Tia, was there anything you wanted to add to that, particularly in relation to the availability of other kinds of trucks that aren't necessarily rear tippers?
I think that what I have gleaned in the last, I'd say, 5 years is that a lot of this vehicle selection is being handled by more of a performance-based standardization. So we've seen the emergence of clocks, for example, which I know Acciona is a member of. So that is really about setting a higher performance standard for vehicles being used on construction sites, incorporating things like better visibility. It might include better stability metrics, eventually does not currently do so. It's very hard in this industry to have prescriptive standards because of the variability in age, in sort of types. So I think having a higher level prescriptive standard that you can set as a gold standard, it's not necessarily that you have to do it, but if you do have this gold standard vehicle, maybe then there's some sort of enticement. And I think that's the best way to go and the way that I think the industry is moving toward.
No, thank you. We were talking earlier about 4 to 5 degree incline in terms of potential rule of thumb with respect to if everything's going well on the day, this is the sort of angle that you could potentially have a vehicle tipping on. What does that actually look like in practice? What sorts of things might look like 4 or 5 degrees?
I think I showed in that example a truck on a slope that most would probably consider to be relatively flat, highlighting that as you increase your complexity, I'll call it, so increase in points of articulation, maybe you've got a load where it was raining, for example, so it's sort of wet and sludgy and more likely to stick. You might have a higher chance to have potholes on your site because it's been raining or something like that. So it really isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately. The reality is on some days you could go up to 7-8 degrees and have no issue because it's a beautiful sunny day and everything's great. And then on another day, you might not have so much luck. The question you're asking is quite complex, actually, and requires probably a lot more work by industry as a sort of consortium to really come up with a solution that is purpose-driven, that is not too complex, and that doesn't prevent sort of operational capacity, but that solve some of these safety issues. There's things like I cannot say the word.
Inclinability.
Don't say the word. Yes. So you could incorporate something like that. However, again, having something that's prescriptive may prevent you from operating on days where you could quite reasonably operate on such a slope.
Interesting, David, to consider with road engineers and road designs around Australia, they all design in a camber of around 2 to 3 degrees for shedding water and things like that. It's very sensitive, though. It's incredibly sensitive window we're talking about here.
I think that's exactly right, Andre. We're not talking about a very, very big side slope, particularly if all those factors start to combine, as Tia was talking about with respect to the complexity. Tia, seeing as you went to inclinometers, why don't we talk a little bit about safety devices that potentially come with particular types of vehicles, and whether there are things out there in industry that you can look for in tip trucks that might assist in terms of preventing or minimising the risk of rollover. And perhaps, Tia, if I start with you, and then Julian, I might throw across to you for other things that you've seen in your travels.
They do have that technology, so you can find trucks. What I will highlight is I don't know a lot of research that's been done on the accuracy of those over time, for example. Do they need to be calibrated? At what rate do they need to be calibrated? You start running into those issues. Also, with respect to drivers receiving, warnings, often, and we've seen this, with telematic systems, for example, when you start to get things that are beeping at you all the time, what you get is complete ignoring of that system. And so it really does need to be set at a level that is probably slightly higher than what I'll call bottom level danger, because otherwise what you're going to get is you're going to get a beeping warning every single time you're tipping, and that's not something that's going to be effective. I would highlight that I think it's something that needs future work. A manufacturer can put a system on there and say, yeah, we've got something that measures angle, but I don't know that it's necessarily effective in the field. And that's something that probably your audience here could report back on if they're finding those to be effective or ineffective is an important question.
So I would definitely echo that. I think there's definitely a need to do more work in that area. I mean, in these days, we can get aeroplanes that fly themselves. So I don't think it's beyond our ability as a race to innovate and get something that works. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for the industry to move forward and be. I mean, we get mobile cranes that have got inbuilt limiters, and those kind of things. So obviously, it's doable. I think from a federal safety officer's perspective, what I would expect to see is sophistication or process or rigor around exclusion zones, so that how you're determining what they are, not just relating to truck and dogs tipping over, but general people plant separation. So we need to see clarity so that people understand what you mean by an exclusion zone. So we don't just say exclusion zones and then allow people in there. There's got to be a protocol to allow someone into an exclusion zone. What does it mean? Tools down, everything gets isolated, all those kind of things. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to be better planned, I guess. And I guess what we're expecting from an FSC perspective is that your systems, your project risk assessment, your project risk register clarifies and is used to manage that from a risk perspective. And then you've got clear controls about how to enter an exclusion zone, how to delineate an exclusion zone, how to communicate that exclusion zone, be it in a VMP or a traffic plan or something like that, part of your pre-starts as they change. So yeah, we're looking for that from a bit more sophistication, I guess, in terms of making sure that that's coordinated and planned on a site-by-site basis.
I might just go back to one of the other complicating factors that Tia, you referenced, and particularly in those videos that you showed us, was one of the key causes for the rollover incidents, and that was the sticky load. What sorts of early warning signs might you get that a load is sticky, and what sorts of controls would you suggest people be considering with respect to tipping operations and sticky loads?
I think, I don't operate tippers, I should just say. Their question was raised, can a driver see that the load is sticking? I think that's a great question. I think the driver can probably see that the load has ceased to leave the rear of the vehicle, but possibly can't see directly that the load is clumping in a corner, for example. I think one of the best ways to prevent the sticking is actually in the design of the trailer. So we see things like non-slip lining on the floor, and there's plenty of video examples where you can watch a tipping operation where we've got non-stick versus stick. And that really has a really good effect on releasing that load in a nice, consistent way. We've also got these sort of walking floor trailers. I didn't show a video example of that, but that really is where the trailer has a mechanism to actually sort of push that load downward in a very controlled way. And that's, again, an engineering solution. So if you think about that control hierarchy, those are higher on our system. You could incorporate something like a camera where you could actually have a driver being able to see where that load is sticking. And then of course you would need some sort of procedure for what you're going to do when that happens. You know, you're going to lower the trailer back down and sort of have a mechanism to where you're going to redistribute that load. Those are just some off the top of my head.
Look, we've probably got time for one last question. So I might just go to the planning stage and just ask the panel in particular around, Andre, in relation to Ashiana, how you guys are incorporating this plant selection and the control processes into the planning stage. And then Tia and Julian, whether there's anything you guys wanted to add to that in relation to other options that you've seen out there that are effective.
The way we're incorporating into the planning stage is designated tip and laydown areas. They must be planned. They must be communicated. And when we say communicated, they've got to be communicated to what we often forget about, the key people, that being the truck drivers. And let's just stop and consider that. The truck drivers are so integral to this operation and they have to have responsibility in this whole operation too. So that whole communication piece, once it's been designated, the tip and laydown areas is vital. And that can occur in a process 20 metres down the road, stop with a whatever it might be and communicate, get out, walk it, show them whatever it might be before the tipping operations commence. Crossfall, laydown areas need to be flat and firm and avoid crossfall. We spoke about that and how we're not mandating that it has to be X amount of degrees and things like that, because that's going to be somewhat problematic. In terms of flat and firm is a given. The exclusion must ensure no-go exclusion zone ground trailer. Again, to the point made earlier by Julian, the communication and making sure that delineation is very clear and non-ambiguous is important. Competency, drivers must be properly trained for tipper operations. And I guess just to that point, that also is a challenge. We're talking about the challenge in a pretty hot market of trying to choose trucks and truck selection being, you know, they're all very busy. What we're seeing around the country, and I know a lot of other people are, and it's not just in truck drivers, a number of different facets. We're bringing new people into the industry, which is wonderful, but they don't have the experience, and we're certainly seeing that with truck drivers too. So that competency piece is a very important thing, and it's something that we often overlook, whether it's for delivery of concrete in an agitator or a tip truck. It really is something that we need to be very aware of in terms of their competency. Lastly, what I would answer today is positioning, the truck positioning and setup, and gets back to the planning in terms of the axles being in line and not on the angle, which all of those things on the angle, the slope, the wet, all of those sticky load, all of those things is a Swiss cheese effect. It really does highlight those things. So I guess that overall planning and communication in a clear, unambiguous way of that planning. David?
So I guess from my perspective, I totally reiterate what Andre said there, and what we would expect is that organisations have got those clear standards, rules, non-negotiables, GMRs, you know, essentials, whatever they are, that they're clearly documented and implementable, so that they're not ambiguous. What an exclusion zone means, or what a VMP has to do as a minimum, what flat means in terms of gradients, so that there's no kind of potential for people to misunderstand what's expected of them. So yeah, it's just been clear on what organisations, how they're going to manage these risks from a truck and dog perspective, but also general mobile plant movements and other vehicle movements on site, be it light vehicles and heavy vehicle interactions, excavators rolling over, you know, the whole gamut of mobile plant heavy vehicle management is the intention should be to keep people away, so that those machines can go about their business and, you know, not have anybody on the ground near them. So that's what we'll be expecting, is that organisations are clear on how they're going to manage that risk.
And we probably need to wrap this one up. I do want to extend a very big thank you to our presenters today, Andre, Tia and Julian. Really do appreciate the time and the generosity with which you went into a great level of detail in terms of identifying what it is that people need to be thinking about. when you are doing something as routine as tipping operations. And we see these sorts of things happen on a daily basis on most construction sites right around the country. And I think, Andre, you summed it up really well when you said, this issue has been staring us in the face for a long time as an industry. We've had a few incidents now that have really highlighted that this is not an unforeseeable risk. And now the onus is on all of us to think about how we're going to control that, how we're going to keep people safe, how we're going to make sure that everyone goes home safe at the end of the day. I hope everyone on the presentation today managed to get some really good ideas in relation to how you can control for the hazards associated with using different types of tippers on site. And you've got a more general appreciation of the fact that tippers are not all equal when it comes to how they do their particular operations. This is, as I mentioned earlier, the last OFSC safety webinar for 2023. So I do want to wish everybody on the call a very Merry Christmas, very safe Christmas, and hope to see everyone back again in 2024 for some more safety webinars from the OFSC. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you all later.